It is with great pleasure and honor that I turn to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Bart Ehrman, the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, is a national celebrity. He has appeared on television shows such as Dateline on NBC, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and The Colbert Report, and on radio shows like Fresh Air and Talk of the Nation. He has written and edited around 30 books, some heavily on scholarship, others approaching a more popular approach that could engage the wider public. I stopped counting at a certain point, finally realizing that it is more important to read the books than to count them. 5 of those books were featured on the New York Times bestseller list, and his works have been translated all over the world to languages such as Greek, Slovak, Polish, Czech, Portuguese, Romanian, Bulgarian, Italian, Turkish, Dutch, German, Serbian, Korean, Japanese, Indonesian, and Chinese, to name but a few. In other words, people want to listen to what Bart Ehrman has to say. His field of study is similar to that of George Mendenhall, the Bible, although 1,000 years separate their interests. Professor Ehrman is an expert on the New Testament and on Jesus and his life. Whereas George Mendenhall was consumed by the origin and the beginning of the Israelites in the Iron Age, Bart Ehrman's work is focused on the origin and the beginning of what we eventually came to call Christianity. These two men, Mendenhall and Ehrman, share a passion for their subject, and they also share a strong sense of healthy suspicion. And if you read Professor Ehrman's book, you cannot avoid that. An essential ingredient to any meaningful scholarship toward the texts and the authors who took upon themselves to present these early beginnings of what came to be some of the most influential categories of Western civilization: the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the people of Israel and their monotheistic God, Jesus and his students, the Messiah, Christ, all come under meticulous scrutiny by Mendenhall and Ehrman, respectively, each one in his own 1,000 years. We in Michigan, as a public and secular university, share this scholarly agenda, studying these religions, but not preaching them, respecting the religious traditions, but not necessarily believing them. It is no surprise, therefore, that George Mendenhall was a foundational figure at our institution and at my department. And for the same reason that brought him to prominence, we are also delighted for the opportunity to host and learn from Professor Bart Ehrman. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ehrman, who will speak to us today about Jesus, the law, and the new, quote-unquote, covenant. Professor Ehrman, please.
Well, thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction. George Mendenhall was one of the truly great scholars of Hebrew Bible in the 20th century, and I'm humbled to be mentioned in the same breath. He brought considerable prestige to this university in the fields of ancient Near East and biblical studies, and so I'm also deeply honored to be asked to give a talk at an occasion inspired by his work. It gets less interesting. Okay, right. So, Jesus, the law, and a new covenant. I'm going to begin by talking about some of the issues that I want to address in this lecture. And I'm going to start by describing how I begin my course on the New Testament at Chapel Hill every year. So I teach a class on the New Testament that has, it's a large enrollment. It usually has 240 students, 350 students. It depends how many students we want to let into the class. And every year I begin the class by first day of class handing out the syllabus and explaining that this is a class at a research university. This is not a class being given in a church. This is not a Sunday school. This is a class that will be approaching the New Testament not from a devotional point of view of faith, but from a historical and a literary point of view, trying to understand the New Testament from these other perspectives. That's not necessarily better than the way it's done in church or in Sunday school, but it's certainly different. Now, most of my students are from North Carolina, which means most of my students were raised in the church as conservative Christians. And so most of my students still are conservative Christians. And so I have to explain to them that this class, they'll have no advantage by having been a Christian. It doesn't matter for the class whether they are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or atheist or pagan or anything else, because we're not approaching it from the perspective of faith. And so I try to explain that all to them, and then we go through the syllabus and explain how the class is going to be set up. And then the second half of that first period, I give my students a pop quiz. Now, they think this is a little bit odd that I'd be giving them a pop quiz before I've taught them anything. But when I'm starting to teach this class, I want to know how much do they know about the Bible. I also want them to know how much they know about the Bible. Because a lot of the students are taking the class because it fulfills some requirements in the curriculum, and they're thinking, how hard can it be? It's the New Testament. We're not talking about, quantum physics here. It's the New Testament. And so we give them this quiz. The quiz has 11 questions on it. And I tell my students that if anyone in here gets 8 of these 11 right, I'll buy you dinner at the Armadillo Grill. Last year, out of my 240 students, I bought 1 dinner. And the thing is, these are not hard questions. These are not complicated questions involving deep knowledge of scholarship. These are basic, factual questions about the New Testament that anybody who's at all knowledgeable about the New Testament, they ought to know the answer to these questions. So just to give you an example, I begin the quiz. First question is, how many books are in the New Testament? Well, that's just a basic factual piece of information, and it knocks off about half the class because people don't know. And it turns out, I can see some of you are looking a little confused and shaking your heads. So the answer is 27. And I tell my students that actually is a very easy answer. The reason it's an easy answer is this. When you think about the Bible, you think about God. When you think about the New Testament, you think about the Christian God. And when you think about the Christian God, you think about the Trinity. And what is 27? It's 3 to the third power. 3 times 3 times 3, 27. It's a miracle. So the second question I ask is, in what language were those books written? Now, this is interesting because about half the students think that the answer is Hebrew. And I've never quite figured it out, but I think it's because when you watch all those shows on Discovery Channel or on the History Channel about Jesus, they're always flashing up Hebrew text behind him. And so you think Hebrew, and you think he's Jewish, Hebrew. It's Hebrew, right? Wrong. No, it's not Hebrew. Hebrew's wrong. Luckily, every semester, only 4 or 5 of the students think that the answer is English. That's wrong, too. So the answer is Greek. And so, and I explained to them it's because Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, and I talk about Alexander the Great, and I use this quiz as a way to teach some basic factual historical information. So I go through this quiz. There are 11 of these questions. There are a few curveballs on the quiz. I throw a few curveballs because I don't want to buy any dinners. So, for example, one of the questions is, what was the Apostle Paul's last name? And invariably somebody will say, of Tarsus. Okay, Paul of Tarsus, yes, okay, good enough. But I do that because I want them to realize that people in the ancient world, most people in the ancient world didn't have last names. People had one name, which is why in the New Testament you have a number of people with the same first name, and they always have to identify which person it is. And so you have all these women named Mary, but they tell you which Mary they're talking about. Are they talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene? They all have they have descriptions so that you understand which name they're talking about. So the reason I want my students to know this is because most of them don't understand that Jesus Christ Christ, Christ is not his last name. It's not Jesus Christ born to Joseph and Mary Christ. It means Jesus is the Messiah. And so I explain all this stuff too. So the last question on the quiz is I give them a list of names and I ask them which of these people were Jews. And so I have, what do I have on there? I have John the Baptist, and I have the Apostle Paul, and I have Julius Caesar, and I have Tacitus, and I have Jesus. And so I have these names, and they have to decide which ones are Jews. And interestingly, these days, virtually everybody gets it right. About 20 years ago when I was teaching, a lot of people didn't get everything right. The reason I ask this question is because, as I said, I'm using this as an opportunity to teach, and I want to stress on the first day of class that Jesus was a Jew. Now, most of my students think, yeah, he was a Jew, but he was really a Christian. Well, yeah, probably not quite yet. But they do recognize, yes, Jesus was a Jew. And so it starts, when you start pressing this with the students, though, it leads to a little bit of confusion after a while. If Jesus was a Jew, did he follow the Jewish law? My students usually think, well, yeah, he probably did. He was Jewish. Then they'll think, wait a second, he was breaking Sabbath the whole time. So, no, he didn't follow the law. Well, did he follow the law or not? No, he probably didn't follow it. Well, then how was he Jewish? Well, so there's a little, they aren't quite sure how to work that one out. And so, what about Jesus' expectations? Did he expect his followers to follow the law? No, I don't think so. No, Jesus didn't, because Jesus is starting a new religion, right? So his followers don't have to follow the law. But then other students say, well, no, actually, if he was Jewish, he probably kept the law himself, and he probably told his followers to follow the law, but it was after his death that they stopped following the law, that you started having Christianity as a separate thing. And other students will say, no, yeah, probably Jesus did think his followers should follow the law, and so probably Christians should follow some of the laws. Well, which laws? And when you press my students on this, do you think that Christians should follow the laws of the Old Testament? My students will almost always say no. Say, okay, so it's okay to commit murder and adultery? Oh, no, you can't do that. Why not? Because it's in the Ten Commandments. That's part of the law. Oh, well, okay, yeah, but Jesus wanted us to follow the Ten Commandments. He just didn't want us to follow the other laws. I said, okay, so you're supposed to follow the Ten Commandments. Right. Okay, so you shall honor your father and mother. That one? Is that one of the 10? Yeah, that's one of the 10. Are you supposed to follow that? Yeah. Now, do you agree with what's said in the next chapter in the book of Exodus, that if you curse your father or mother, you're to be put to death? No, we don't think that's right. Okay. So, so you say you ought to follow the Ten Commandments. What do you think about working on Saturday? What do you mean? Well, it says you're supposed to observe the Sabbath. You're supposed to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, yeah. Well, that means you're not supposed to work on Saturday. Oh, yeah, we don't do that. Okay, so you follow the 9 commandments. And so it just raises some confusion in students' heads about what's supposed to be the relationship between what emerges in Jesus' wake as Christianity. What's the relationship of that to the religion out of which Jesus came? And students have very vague and confused ideas about this. And part of my point of this lecture is that the confusion is not merely modern. That Christians have long contended with this issue, and there's never been a single answer to the question. So, let me provide a little bit of background very briefly. This is a ridiculous thing. I'm going to, in 4 minutes, tell you about what it meant to be Jewish in the days of Jesus. Of course, being Jewish in the days of Jesus meant doing things that Jews did, whatever that was, going to synagogue, or praying, or reading the Torah, or what. But I'm thinking at this point about what it is that made Jews distinctively Jews in the world of Jesus. The world of Jesus was the world of the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, 93% of the world was non-Jewish. And so modern people might say this 93% was pagan. So pagan, when historians use the word pagan, they're not using it with derogatory connotations. The way that I use it when I say that my next door neighbor is a real pagan, which by the way he is. Pagan simply means anybody who's not Jewish in the ancient world, Jewish or Christian. So everybody in the ancient world, apart from Jews, worshipped many gods, and Jews were distinctive because they did not worship many gods. Jews worshipped one God. The God of Israel was the one God that Jews would worship. Some Jews probably thought these other gods existed, but they weren't going to worship them. Other Jews thought, in fact, these other gods don't even exist. There's only one God. But Jews did insist on worshiping one God, the creator of the world, the one almighty God, the God who had chosen Israel to be his people. That's the God that's to be worshiped. And being Jewish in the days of Jesus meant worshiping that one God. Jews throughout the world thought that this one God had chosen Israel and given Israel its covenant. The word covenant means something like a peace accord or a peace treaty. A covenant was something that was given from a dominant nation to a lesser nation, and the idea was that God, the great power, had given the Jewish people an agreement. And the agreement was that God would protect and defend his people, that he would be their God if they would be his people. Okay? He'll be their God. He will protect and defend them if they'll be his people. This was the agreement. And so the Jewish people believed that this one God had made a special arrangement with them, the Jewish people. Part of that covenant was the law that God had given to the nation of Israel. The law indicated how Jews were supposed to worship God. It gave restrictions and directions for worship, and indicated how Jews were to relate to one another in their community. And so it's how they were to live together in community and how they were to worship God. Many of my students in the South, in the U.S. South, have a completely wrong idea of what traditional Jewish religion was all about. Many of my students think that the whole deal with Judaism was that God gave Jews a law that they could not possibly keep. And since they didn't keep this law, God sent them all to hell. And that's why Jesus showed up. It's because everybody was supposed to follow a law that they couldn't keep, and so they were all going to go to hell, and so Jesus came up to save them from hell. And that's the Jewish religion. It's religion where everybody's going to go to hell because they've got this law. And this law is like this huge burden that people have to follow, and it's hard, and nobody can do it. And so that's a common view among my students, and it's completely wrong historically. The law given to Israel was not a particularly onerous law. It wasn't particular. I mean, you read through the law. You just read through the law in the Hebrew Bible. It is not a terribly difficult thing. I mean, it's not like American law. I mean, we have so many laws just controlling, like how you can drive a car, or what kind of things you can put in your mouth, or what. I mean, we have all these laws. I mean, so Jewish law is not. It wasn't like that. This was God telling you how you can worship Him and how you can relate to each other. This is seen as the greatest good. I mean, can you imagine the creator of the universe telling you how you can live? It's fantastic. Well, Jews understood that the law had been given, and following the law was not in order to earn your way into heaven. It was how you live together as community in response to God who's given the covenant. So, yeah, right, that's my 4-minute version of what it meant to be a Jew in the days of Jesus. So, Jesus had followers that eventually became Christianity. And the big question I want to struggle with in this lecture is, how did Jesus' followers after his day understand the relationship to this law that God had given, the law that's still found in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, the law of Moses? What is the relationship of the Christian to this law? Did God get rid of this law? Many Christians, most Christians would say we still worship the God of Jesus. So, if that God gave the law, has He decided to rescind the law? Well, has He changed His mind, for example? That's the question. So, I'm going to go through a number of options that we know about from early Christianity. A number of options for how one understands the relationship of the follower of Jesus to the law of the Jews. And so, option number 1, I'm going to begin at the sort of in the middle of the second Christian century. So we're talking 120 years after Jesus was dead. 120 years later, when we have some pretty good evidence about what some Christians were thinking about this particular issue. I'm going to begin with a group of Christians called the Marcionites. They were called the Marcionites because they were followers of a particular theologian, philosopher, whose name just happened to be Marcion. The Marcionites were a very interesting and distinctive group because Marcion himself had a very distinctive and interesting teaching. Marcion was particularly obsessed with the Apostle Paul and the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul taught that Christ had saved people by His death and His resurrection. And Paul differentiated between the gospel of Christ, which brings salvation, and the law of the Jews that brings condemnation. This is, my students resonate with this. So, Paul, the law of the Jews brings condemnation. The gospel of Christ brings salvation. Paul differentiated between the law and the gospel, and Marcion took very close note of that. Marcion maintained that the God who gave the law cannot be the same God who brought salvation. The God of the Hebrew Bible, of what Christians would call the Old Testament, the Old Testament God is actually a different God from the God of Jesus. Marcion wrote a book called The Antitheses, the Contrary Statements, where he tried to show that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. So, for example, he points out that in the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament tells the children of Israel they're supposed to take the Promised Land. Well, the problem is somebody already lives in the Promised Land. So how are we supposed to have the Promised Land? Well, you've got to kill the people who are in there. Really? Yes. So, Joshua chapter 6, God commands the troops under Joshua to go in and take the city of Jericho. You know the story. They're supposed to march around the city once a day for 6 days. Seventh day, they march around 7 times. They blow the trumpets, they shout, and the walls will come a-tumbling down, and it happens. And God says, go into the city and murder every man, woman, and child in the city. Marcion tells the story, and then he says, is this the same God that says, love your enemy? If somebody persecutes you, pray for them. If somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. No, that's not the same God. They're different gods. You've got a wrathful God in the Old Testament, and you've got a merciful God in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you have the prophet Elisha, a man of God, who's walking by a group of boys. And these boys start making fun of him. He's going bald. And so they call out, Baldy, Baldy. And Elisha calls the wrath of God down. And 2 she-bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of them to death. Is this the same God who says, let the little children come unto me? No, it's not the same God. It's a different God. Marcion literally thought there were 2 gods. Literally thought there were 2 gods. The God of the Old Testament was the God who created this world and chose Israel and gave them the law, and the God of Jesus is the God who saves people from that God. They're 2 separate gods. Jesus does not belong to the Creator God. Jesus wasn't even a material being in this world, because if Jesus had been born of the union of Joseph and Mary and been born like everybody else, he'd be a creature like everybody else, which would mean he'd belong to the Creator like everyone else. So Jesus was never born. Jesus descended from heaven as a full-grown man and wasn't really a fleshly human being because he didn't belong to the Creator. Why didn't Marcion simply read the New Testament to realize it wasn't that way? There wasn't a New Testament. It didn't exist yet. Of course, the books that later were put into the New Testament existed, but there wasn't a canon of Scripture yet. Marcion may well have been the first Christian to devise a canon. He had something like our Gospel of Luke, and he had something like 10 of our letters of Paul, and that was it. His Bible didn't have 66 books in it the way the Christian Bible typically has. He had 11 books. No Old Testament. That's the book for the Jews. Well, whatever you think of that, it's a rather elegant solution about what to do about the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament. You simply get rid of the Old Testament. At the same time Marcion was doing this, there was another group of Christians known as the Ebionites. The Ebionites did not share Marcion's high praise of Paul. The Ebionites thought that Paul was the arch heretic who got everything wrong. He got everything wrong because he didn't understand the relationship of the gospel of Christ to the law of the Jews. Among other things, the Ebionites wanted to insist that there's only one God. Marcion's wrong, and anybody who thinks there's more than one God is completely wrong. These are radical monotheists. They're radical monotheists in part because they are very serious about their Jewish commitments. Jesus for the Ebionites was the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. So this religion, this following Jesus, is completely Jewish for the Ebionites. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, then of course you have to follow the Jewish law. And so the Ebionites insisted that in fact the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, that is the Bible. Now they may have had other books as well. Some people think they had something like the Gospel of Matthew, which is widely considered to be the most Jewish of our Gospels. They may have had other books, but they certainly had the Jewish Bible. For them, Christianity was the fulfillment of Judaism, but that didn't mean you got rid of Judaism. Christianity was the correct interpretation of Judaism, and so Ebionites were Jews, and they continued to be Jews. They circumcised their babies, they kept kosher, they observed Sabbath, they followed the festivals, they were Jewish. This is a pretty stark contrast with Marcion. They contrast up and down the line. Marcion thinks there's two gods, the Ebionites think there's one God. Marcion thinks that Paul's the hero, the Ebionites think Paul's the heretic. Marcionites think that Jesus was a divine being but not a human being. The Ebionites think he's a human Messiah, not a divine being. The Marcionites have something like the Gospel of Luke. The Ebionites have something like the Gospel of Matthew. The Marcionites don't have the Old Testament. The Ebionites do have the Old Testament. I know Christians who line up on one or the other side today. I know Christians who, of course I know Christians who insist that, who are still Jewish, who maintain their Jewishness. At least they say they do. The Messianic Jews who understand themselves to be both Jewish and Christian. I know a lot of other Christians who think that they've never heard of Marcion, but if they had heard of Marcion, they would think that he was onto something, because you have the Old Testament God of wrath and the New Testament God of love, and that just makes inherent sense for a lot of people who aren't quite sure why they have an Old Testament, but you know they have it. And so you get people on both sides. Well, there are other options. Here's a third option that you have from the ancient world from about the same time as these groups, the letter of Barnabas. The letter of Barnabas was probably written in the 130s, a little bit before Marcion was doing his thing. The letter of Barnabas almost made it into the New Testament. There were church fathers who thought the letter of Barnabas belonged in the New Testament. I think we can be very grateful it didn't make its way into the New Testament, because this book is more anti-Jewish than anything that did make it into the New Testament. The letter of Barnabas is principally about how to understand the relationship of the followers of Jesus and the Jewish people, and how to understand the relationship between the followers of Jesus and the Jewish law. Barnabas maintains that the Jews had been given the covenant of God with the law under Moses, but they broke the covenant just as soon as they got it. And so Barnabas tells the story about how in the Old Testament, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, and God gives him the 2 tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. And then he learns that the people down below are making idols for themselves and engaging in wild activities, and he comes down and he sees what's going on. He throws down the 2 tablets of the law and smashes them. Barnabas says this indicates that the Jews literally broke their covenant. The Israelites broke the covenant, and for Barnabas, it was never restored. Jews who had just had the covenant made with them broke it. Jews, for Barnabas, never have been the people of God. Okay? What about the law? Barnabas maintains that since Jews were never the people of God, they never understood the law that God gave them. They never understood their own law. Much of Barnabas, this letter of Barnabas, is designed to show what the true interpretation of the law is, and to show how the Jews have misinterpreted their law. They've misinterpreted their law because they've taken their law literally. But God never meant the law to be taken literally. And Barnabas shows how this is by going through a whole bunch of laws to show how these have been misunderstood. For example, kosher food laws. When the Bible says, don't eat pork, it doesn't mean don't have ham sandwiches. That's a literal interpretation. That's not what it means. Not partaking of pork means not behaving like pigs. For Barnabas, that means this. Pigs, when they're hungry, grunt and make a ton of noise. When they're fed, they don't. You should not be like that. You should not pray to God whenever you are in desperate need, and then when your needs are satisfied, you have no communication with God. You should pray to God all the time. Don't behave like a pig. That's what it means. Don't eat pork. Barnabas goes through a number of the kosher food laws and gives the correct interpretation that those Jews have never understood. The Sabbath day. Jews say you should not work on Saturday. You should observe the Sabbath. They completely misunderstand, according to Barnabas. Barnabas points out that the Sabbath day requirement is rooted in the creation in the book of Genesis, where God creates the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rests, thereby sanctifying the seventh day. Jews have misunderstood that to think that it means that they themselves are not supposed to work on the seventh day, and that's not what it means at all. What's going on is this. In the Bible, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. When the Bible says that God created the world in 6 days, it means that the creation is going to last 6,000 years. The day of rest is the millennium that's coming, the 1,000-year period of peace that's going to come to earth. It's not talking about what you're supposed to do on Saturday. It's talking about what's going to happen in our future when the end comes. Barnabas is the first one that I know of who indicates that the world's going to last 6,000 years. You may remember this was kind of a big deal back in the year 2000 when people thought, well, this is it, because fundamentalists thought the world was created in 4,000 BC, and now it's 2,000, that's 6,000, this is it. Well, Barnabas is the first one to come up with that particular bit of reasoning. You can imagine this kind of reasoning wasn't all that convincing to many Jews. Especially this last one was not. Circumcision. Jews circumcise their baby boys. Barnabas thinks this is a ridiculous literal interpretation. You shouldn't. No, you're not supposed to be circumcising your baby boy. What is circumcision? Barnabas points out that that God gave the sign of circumcision to Abraham. And Barnabas talks about how Abraham was told to circumcise the 318 servants of his that went off to save the nephew of Abraham, Lot, who had been captured by some other foreign kings. And so he circumcised 318. And so what does that mean? Why 318? Well, Barnabas points out that in the Greek Old Testament, 318, the way that ancient languages wrote out numbers was by taking letters of the alphabet, and each letter had a numerical value. And so if you write out 318 in Greek, it'd be a tau, that looks like an English T, and then a iota, which is like a J, and then an eta, which is like an E. So it's TJE. And he points out T looks like a cross. And J and E are the first two letters in the name Jesus. Circumcision is the cross of Jesus. You're not supposed to be cutting the foreskin off your baby boys. You're supposed to be believing in the cross of Jesus. It's right there in the Old Testament. Barnabas concludes that little example by saying, no one has ever learned a better lesson from me. I'm sure he's right. Barnabas thinks that the Old Testament was never a Jewish book. It's a Christian book. It's a Christian book that needs to be interpreted in light of Christian principles. Well, okay, let me give you a fourth option. The three I've given you so far are after the New Testament. What about inside the New Testament? There are various views within the New Testament, not just outside the New Testament. Let me give you one that is very surprising to my students. It's surprising because some of them have read this before, but they've never really thought about it. It's the view that you find in the Gospel of Matthew, the first Gospel. In the first major teaching of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus explicitly tells his followers, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away until from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The scribes and the Pharisees for Matthew, are the highly religious Jews, and you have to keep the law better than them. What? You have to keep the law better than the most religious Jews? Yes. For Matthew, the answer is yes. That's in the New Testament? Yes, that's in the New Testament. This is the view that you find in the Gospel of Matthew. Christ did not abolish the law. Christ fulfilled the law, and his followers have to follow the law. And then Jesus proceeds to explain what he means. You've heard it said that you should not murder. I say to you, you should not only not murder, you should not get angry with someone else. You murder somebody out of anger, don't even get angry in the first place. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Don't take someone else's spouse. What I say to you is, don't even think about it. Don't even want to take your neighbor's spouse. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that the punishment should fit the crime. I say to you, turn the other cheek. Jesus radicalizes the law and makes it more difficult. He doesn't get rid of the law. Jesus doesn't say, you've heard it said that you should not commit adultery, but I say to you, you should commit adultery. He doesn't get rid of the law. He makes the law harder in Matthew. Christ's followers have to do the law even more strictly than the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus himself is portrayed as the new Moses in Matthew's gospel. Jesus goes up on the mount and he delivers an interpretation of the law of Moses, because for Matthew's gospel, Jesus is the new Moses. He's not a new Moses who replaces the old Moses. The old Moses is still there, but Jesus gives his interpretation of the law, which now has to be followed. So you have to follow the law, and you have to follow Jesus' interpretation of the law. It's an interesting question whether the Gospel of Matthew thinks that the followers of Jesus have to be Jews. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, because Matthew doesn't come out and say. When Matthew does talk about the laws that people have to follow, in every case it's things like adultery and murder and turning the other cheek and so on and so on. It's not. He doesn't talk about laws like the laws of circumcision or kosher food. So it's hard to know. Does Jesus want his followers to keep everything in the law? Some scholars think the answer is yes, that Matthew wanted his followers to be Jews. And others think the answer is no, that maybe he's just interpreting maybe ethical laws instead of ritual laws. It's an open question. What's not an open question is that Matthew had a high evaluation of the law and thought that Jesus' followers had to follow the law rigorously. Jesus' own interpretation of the law, in a sense, becomes the new law. You have to follow not just the prescriptions of Moses, but Jesus' interpretation of the prescriptions of Moses. Let me take a step back now and ask what Jesus himself thought. I've talked about what the Marcionites thought Jesus taught, and what the Ebionites thought Jesus taught, what Barnabas thought Jesus taught, and now what Matthew thought Jesus taught. What did Jesus teach? There is, as you know, an enormous range of views about what Jesus actually said during his ministry. And so I'm going to give you a rather non-controversial aspect of this. Jesus in relationship to the law. Virtually everybody that I know of who works on the historical Jesus thinks that Jesus was and meant to be law observant, that Jesus himself followed the Jewish law. Sometimes it's thought that Jesus wasn't following the law because he's breaking the Sabbath all over the place. When you actually read the New Testament Gospels, it's very hard to find any place where Jesus breaks the Sabbath. You can find places where Jesus breaks how other Jews might have interpreted how you're supposed to observe the Sabbath, but you can't really find places where Jesus actually does things that are outlawed in the law of Moses with respect to Sabbath. So there were different opinions about what it meant to observe the Sabbath, and Jesus had one set of opinions that others had different opinions about. Pretty much it looks like Jesus was law observant. Jesus was almost certainly a teacher of the law. If Jesus was a teacher of any sort, he was certainly a Jewish teacher. What does a Jewish teacher teach in the first century? He teaches the law, his interpretation of the law. So Jesus observed the law and he taught the law. Jesus did have disagreements with other teachers, especially Pharisees. Jesus wasn't the only one who had disagreements with Pharisees. Sadducees had disagreements with Pharisees. Essenes had disagreements with Pharisees. And most especially, Pharisees had disagreements with Pharisees. There were all sorts of disagreements within Judaism. It continues down to today, as you know. Jesus had disagreements with other teachers. It doesn't make him anti-Jewish or un-Jewish or non-Jewish or against the law. It simply makes him a Jewish teacher. Did Jesus plan to start a new religion? Virtually everybody who works on the historical Jesus today from a critical perspective will say the answer is no. Jesus was not planning to start some kind of new religion that was separate from Judaism. Jesus was a Jew who followed Jewish customs and kept the Jewish law and was a Jewish teacher who had Jewish disciples whom he taught his understanding of the Jewish law. Jesus may have wanted to present his own interpretation of what it meant to be one of the people of God, but that wasn't to start a new religion, Christianity. Christianity starts after Jesus' day. It's not something that Jesus himself wanted to start. And so, if that's the case, why did Christians end up changing what it was that Jesus taught? So this last set of points is what I'm going to conclude with. It's going to take me about 10 minutes, I think, to develop this point. After Jesus died, his followers proclaimed that he was the Jewish Messiah. It may be that some of Jesus' followers thought that he was the Messiah before he died, but it is certain that after he died, his followers were calling him the Messiah. They called him the Messiah so much and so frequently that, in fact, Messiah did become his last name. Christ becomes functioning as a name in Christianity, Jesus Christ or Jesus the Messiah. Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. What does it mean to call somebody the Messiah? Here's another thing that my students absolutely don't understand. My students tend to think that if you call somebody the Messiah, that means you're calling them God. No. Being the Messiah has nothing to do with being God for most Jews. It could have divine influence, but for most Jews, no. Being Messiah was not being God. What was it being? So let me give you just the very brief history lesson on the term Messiah. The word Messiah in Hebrew, like the Greek word Christ, literally means anointed one. The anointed one. Originally, it was used of the kings of Israel. The king of Israel, starting with King Saul, the first king, then King David, then King Solomon. The kings were made king, say, during a coronation ceremony by having oil poured on their head. Part of the coronation ceremony, having oil poured on their head, they were anointed with oil as a sign of divine favor. Favored by God, the anointed one. The anointed one originally refers to the king, and in the Christian Old Testament, in the book of 2 Samuel, the second king, the great King David, is told by God that he will always have a descendant sitting on the throne. David will always have a descendant sitting on the throne, the kingly throne, and so there will always be a Davidic king in Jerusalem. So that was true for about 400 years. There was a dynasty, a Davidic dynasty, where there was a king on the throne, until the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem and took the king off the throne. What are people supposed to make of this promise of God that there will always be a Davidic king on the throne, an anointed one on the throne, if there's no longer a king on the throne? Some Jewish thinkers started to think that there'd be a future king on the throne, a future anointed one. The Messiah was that future anointed one, a king like David, a great political, military leader who would sit on the throne and reestablish Israel as a state, as a kingdom. By the time of Jesus, there were people who expected that the future Messiah would be that kingly figure. There were other Jews who had other expectations about what a future anointed one would be. There were some who thought that this future figure who led Israel would be more of a cosmic figure, a divine-like being who would come from heaven to destroy the enemies of God and set up God's kingdom on earth. Call him the Messiah, call him the Son of Man, call him, there were various things they called him, this future one. There were other Jews who expected that the future ruler of Israel would be a great priest who would interpret the law of God for his people and rule over his people with a very stern fist, but as a great interpreter of the law, a powerful priest who would rule the people. There are various expectations about what the Messiah would be like, but one thing all of these expectations had in common was that the Messiah would be a future figure of grandeur and power who would rule over the people of Israel, typically would overthrow the enemy and set up Israel as its own kingdom. A figure of grandeur and power. Christians came along and they said, Jesus is the Messiah. There was a very real problem with that declaration. Everyone knew that Jesus had been crucified. Jesus did not destroy the enemy and set up a kingdom in Israel. Jesus was destroyed by the enemy. Jesus was publicly tortured to death, humiliated and tortured to death. That's the Messiah? That's not the Messiah. That's the opposite of the Messiah. So when I try to get my students to understand what it's like for a first century Jew to agree Jesus is the Messiah, a crucified criminal is the Messiah, what I used to do, I can't do it anymore because now my students don't remember who David Koresh was. But what I used to do was I would say that the kind of gut feeling you'd have by saying Jesus is the Messiah is the gut feeling that you yourself would have if I told you that I think David Koresh is the Lord of the universe. David Koresh, you mean that guy at Waco, the Branch Davidian, and stockpiling arms and abusing kids and who got killed by the FBI? That's the Lord of the universe? Yes, that's the Lord of the universe. What are you, crazy? So I used to get in trouble in this in my class because every year I'd get my course evaluations back and I'd get about a half a dozen who would say, I can't believe that Ehrman thinks that David Koresh is the Lord of the universe. Okay, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's just David Koresh is the opposite for most people at least. So Christians said that Jesus was the Messiah, and most Jews absolutely rejected it. The vast majority of Jews did and do reject this claim. While the early Christians are proclaiming that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, you have the phenomenon of the Apostle Paul. Paul himself was a Jew, was a Pharisee, was apparently a strict and highly religious Jew who, because of the vision that he had of Jesus, came to think that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Paul came to think, apparently maybe at his conversion, right after his conversion, came to think that Jesus' death was absolutely the key to salvation, to being made right with God. And that since Jesus' death is what made people right with God, nothing else had any relationship to being right with God. It was only the death and resurrection of Jesus that mattered. Paul had been raised as a law-observant Jew who thought that the law really mattered. But he came to think that when it came to a relationship with God, the law actually didn't matter. Because if the law mattered, God wouldn't have had Jesus die. Paul knew that God had Jesus die because Paul knew that Jesus had been raised from the dead. If Jesus got raised from the dead, the only way to get raised from the dead is if God raised him. If God raised him, that shows that God favored him. If God favored him, then his death must have been something God planned. His death must be some kind of sacrifice for others. But that means that it's the sacrifice of Jesus that matters, not the law. And so Paul came to think that people could be right with God, could have salvation apart from the law by believing in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so Paul saw himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. He wanted to convert Gentiles, and he did. He started his Gentile mission. Paul converted Gentiles, and Paul had much more success than his counterparts who were trying to convert Jews. Mainly Gentiles were converting to Christianity. If you've got a situation where most Jews are rejecting the message of Jesus, and most of the people who are accepting the message of Jesus are Gentiles who don't keep the Jewish law, why do Christians keep the Old Testament? Why do Christians keep the law if they're not going to follow the law? And why even have an Old Testament? There are lots of reasons why historically Christianity kept the Old Testament. Let me give you one of the reasons that most people have not thought of. During Paul's day, after Paul's day, Christians found opposition from their pagan neighbors and from the Roman rulers on some occasions. Christians were attacked for a reason that might not make much sense today, but made a lot of sense in the ancient world. When it came to ancient religion and philosophy, ancient people really liked antiquity. In the ancient world, people liked ancient stuff. If you were a new religion, there was something wrong. You had to have an old religion. Religions had to be old to be acceptable. Philosophies had to be around for a while to be accepted. You've got to have antiquity. Christians had to have the Old Testament because it gave them antiquity. They could claim that their religion was as old as Moses. Moses predicted Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. The law was looking forward to Jesus. And so Christians had to have the Old Testament, and they claimed the Old Testament, and they claimed the Old Testament was theirs and not the Jews. Because if the Jews could rightly claim it, then the Christians could not rightly claim it. Christians wanted to rightly claim it because they needed antiquity in order to have any credentials at all in the ancient world. Even though they had the law of Moses, most Christians chose not to follow the law of Moses. Most Christians were Gentile. They didn't circumcise their baby boys. They didn't follow kosher food laws. They didn't observe the Sabbath. They didn't keep the Jewish festivals. They didn't do the other parts of the law. They didn't keep the law, but they did want to keep the words of Jesus because they understood that the words of Jesus were a kind of new law. Jesus is the one who tells us how we should live. We keep the Old Testament because it provides us with our ancient roots, but actually we follow the laws given by Jesus. And the question is, are these laws given by Jesus meant to be reinterpretations of the law, or are they meant to be replacements of the law? This was an issue that different Christians had different views on, as we have seen. There remained Christians and still remain Christians who think that Christians should still follow the Jewish laws. Other Christians think that the law is an important part of the Christian canon, but it's not to be followed. My sense is that there are a lot of Christians in the world today who think that we have the law, we have the Old Testament, but they aren't really sure why they have the Old Testament. This was a source of confusion in the ancient world, and I think it continues to be a source of confusion today. Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If people have questions, there are microphones here, and you need to come up to the mic if you want to ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Would you say a few words about the love theme in the teaching of Jesus and what your thoughts are about it?
Yeah, the love theme in the teaching of Jesus. So we have this passage in Matthew where an expert of the law, a lawyer, comes up to Jesus and asks him, Master, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, Jesus replies by quoting a passage from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, that the greatest commandment is, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And then he says, the second commandment is equal to this, which is, and then he quotes Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus then says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, as with most of the things that Jesus says in the New Testament, it's very hard to know if this is actually something Jesus said, or if it's something that Matthew simply said that Jesus said, or if it's something else. But it does seem like this teaching of love is a consistent teaching throughout a lot of the sayings of Jesus. And so there are a lot of scholars who have said that Jesus understood that Jesus understood that the entire law could be summed up in this idea. That you should love God, love your neighbor. And that doesn't absolve you from like following the other parts of the law, but it means that if you really want to get to the heart of the law, that's the heart of the law. And personally, I'm inclined to that teaching. I'm inclined to thinking that is an essence of what Jesus, that Jesus was less concerned with a lot of kind of fine point niceties, and was really concerned with the heart of the law, which he saw as the dual love commandment. Yes?
So I'm sure I've read scholarship that indicates that James, Peter, some of the disciples immediately in the aftermath of the crucifixion were highly observant as traditional Jews. If that's true, how was that understood by the early, second century Christians, and how was it incorporated into this view as to, it's clear what Paul was doing, but as for the behavior of those disciples in Jerusalem specifically, how is that dealt with in it's 2,000 years afterwards?
Yeah, great. So what I want to do is kind of differentiate two things. One is what was really the case with Peter and James and what they were really doing. And the other is how they were later understood. So Peter and James, I think, probably remained observant Jews. And what the Ebionites claimed that their teachings went back to James. So that James, the highly observant Jew, and this is the true interpretation given to us by Jesus' brother, and so we continue to follow the law. Other Christians in the second century got around that problem simply by denying it. Well, actually, no, Peter and James, they realized that Jesus abolished the law, so they came up with something else. So historically, I think Peter and James probably, so these Ebionites are probably less like most Christians today than most of these other early groups, but in some ways they might have been representing the earliest form of Christianity, which is interesting because what it means is that as Christianity develops, what ends up being declared a heresy may have been the original form. Yeah. Yes?
Yes, I don't know if many people, and perhaps I'm right or wrong, but Bart has a fantastic blog that he's had going, and it's raised a lot of money. Bart, I would like you to speak to some of your favorite parts of this blog that you've been doing. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, yeah, let me say something about the blog. I try to say something about this in public events. So I have a blog. It's called the Bart Ehrman Blog. If you're interested in it, look up the Bart Ehrman Blog. You'll find it. So the deal with this blog is I post 5 or 6 times a week and about 1,000 words a day on everything having to do with the New Testament, Jesus, early Christianity, the apostolic fathers, the books that didn't make it into the New Testament, the history of Christianity, the persecution of Christians, the role of women in Christianity, the Hebrew Bible, Greco-Roman world. I mean, like whatever. I mean, I deal with masses of stuff. This thing's been going on for 4.5 years. The only catch is, to get on the blog, you have to pay. I charge $24.95 for a year's subscription, $24.95. Now, the reason I do this is because I give every penny to charity. And so the blog is a way for me to raise money for charity. I do it because I want to communicate knowledge, but frankly, if it weren't for charity, I wouldn't do it because it takes too much time. So I raise money for charity in this blog, and so you should consider joining it. This last year, the blog raised $117,000. So it's real money. So and I give to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. So anyway, if you're interested in the kind of things I've been talking about today, this kind of stuff is like going on the blog all the time. And it's not much money. I mean, it's like, what is it, 50 cents a week that you pay, but it piles up when you get a lot of people on it. So yeah, so thank you for the pitch, and I hope people will think about joining it. So just Google the Bart Ehrman Blog. Yes?
So a question that's been much on my mind recently, I'd like to get your comments on. What was, if anything, the relationship between Jesus and the Essene movement? Was Jesus an Essene? Was this a context he was operating out of?
Yes, thank you. So for those of you who don't know, the Essenes are usually thought of as the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know about the Essenes from several sources. We knew about them before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it was quickly thought that probably this was produced by a group of Essenes. So to kind of summarize the Essenes in a very kind of simple way, the Essenes maintained that they wanted to preserve their own purity, their ritual purity, away from the pollutions of the world. And so the Essene community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls actually started kind of like a monastic-like community off in the wilderness where they wouldn't be influenced by other people in the world, including other Jews, including like the Sadducees and the Pharisees and stuff. And so they were starting their own, they had this own community. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, one of the first thoughts that some people had was, maybe this explains the origins of Christianity. Maybe, you get this group off in the wilderness declaring that the end is coming soon, and that people need to be ready for the coming end, and that sounds like Christianity. And so maybe like Jesus was an Essene, or maybe John the Baptist was an Essene, and so this became an important topic, and for many people continues to be an important topic. So let me tell you my view of it, which is I don't think Jesus was an Essene or connected with the Dead Sea Scroll community. One of the real reasons for that is that I think that his impulse in some ways was just the opposite. So for the Essenes, the idea is you need to remove yourself from impurity so that you yourself are not made impure. And Jesus had just the opposite. I mean, Jesus is accused of hanging out with the tax collectors and sinners and the prostitutes, and so he's got the opposite approach. And so it doesn't sound like an Essene to me. So then the question is, well, was John the Baptist an Essene? He's off in the wilderness. He's talking about the coming kingdom. And so it's possible, but I think there's really no evidence that he was with the Essene. And the Essenes are not out there trying to get converts. I mean, John the Baptist is like baptizing people and wanting people to come to him. And the Essenes are more not like that. So I don't think, what I think is going on is you get different movements in Judaism at the time who are thinking that the end of the age is coming soon. And they have various ways of approaching that. And the Essenes have a way, John the Baptist has a way, Jesus has a way, and then the followers of Jesus end up being a different way. So it's not that they're all like connected to each other directly, it's that they're all sharing the same basic worldview, in my opinion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know how familiar you might be with Breslov Hasidus.
I'm sorry, with?
I know it's not your area of expertise, it's many centuries later, but Breslov Hasidut.
No, I'm not.
Okay, there's the concept that the Tzaddik suffers on behalf of the people, and he can die to atone for their sins, this being applicable for many Tzaddikim, righteous people. Do you think that this is perhaps why Paul stressed the death of Jesus so much, because this kind of atoning death also was pertaining to Gentiles in his view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to know where Paul and others are getting their ideas about the death of Jesus leading to some kind of atonement. It's so hard to know where this is coming from. Is it coming from traditional Jewish understandings of sacrifice, for example? Does he think this replaces the sacrificial system in the temple? Was there some previous kind of existing theology that he's buying into? I just don't think we have the sources of information in order to know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Jesus was a Jew, and we have the Hebrew Bible as part of our Bible. How did anti-Semitism become part of Christianity?
Right, yes. I see I have 30 seconds to answer this question. Right. How did anti-Semitism become? Okay, well, actually, it's related to what I was saying, I think, at the end of this lecture. So it's obviously a very long, it's obviously a very long, complicated story. First thing, I do not use the term anti-Semitism with respect to the ancient world. I think the idea of anti-Semitism, I'm just talking about the term. The term is applicable, I think, to the modern world, starting with the development of anthropological theories of race that you especially get starting in the 19th century, where being a Semite means belonging to a race, and it's a matter of blood. It's birth and blood. Before the development of these race theories, the problem wasn't Semitic blood. The problem was being a Jew. And so if you could convert a Jew to being a Christian, then that was fine. But during the Holocaust, if you were a Jew who converted to Christian, it didn't matter because you were still a Semite. You see, it's even more insidious. So with the ancient world, I don't think we're talking about anti-Semitism. We're talking about the opposition to Jews. And you don't get a lot of opposition to Jews as Jews prior to Christianity. Of course you get Greeks and Romans who make fun of Jews, but they make fun of everybody who's not a Greek or a Roman. So, Jews were not kind of separated off and attacked most of the time. Where you do start getting opposition to Jews for being Jews is in Christianity, and it's because of what I was saying at the end, which is most Jews simply rejected the Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah. This is the very heart of the Christian claim. This is the essence of Christianity, that Jesus is the Messiah, and most Jews rejected this claim. Christians, for reasons of their own, wanted to claim that the Jewish scriptures were their scriptures. And so Christians are feeling rejection from the Jews, and they want to hold on to the Jewish scriptures, even though the Jews, and it just leads to antagonism. And so you start getting antagonism already in the New Testament period, and you have reflections of this antagonism in the Gospels, where in the Gospel of Matthew, the Roman governor who crucified Jesus washes his hands and says, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And all the people, it says, all the people cried out, his blood be upon us and our children. The Jewish people taking responsibility for the death of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, written later, Jesus is talking to a group of Jews, and they're called the Jews, as if it's all the Jews. And he has this controversy with them. And in chapter 8, Jesus says that they're not the children of God, they're the children of the devil. Wow! So this is just already in the New Testament. When you get into the 2nd century, the vast majority of Christians are Gentile. You get a few Jews on the margins, like the Ebionites, but Christians, in order to justify their own theology and their own beliefs, have to reject Jews, and they do, and it leads to the Epistle of Barnabas, and later in that century, it leads to Melito of Sardis. Melito of Sardis is a preacher who we knew of his existence. We didn't know really what he thought or said until a discovery of a sermon of his in the 1940s. In the sermon, he preached on the occasion of the Jewish Passover feast, in which he declared that Jesus was the true Passover and that the Jews rejected their own Passover lamb, but more than that, Jesus actually was God. And the Jews killed him, which means, according to Melito, that Jews killed their own God. So Melito is the first to charge Jews with deicide, the murder of God. And so the thing is, when you have people in the 2nd century saying things like this, like Barnabas or Melito, when they're saying things like this, they are a tiny little minority, and Jews are a fairly substantial group. So at this time, there might be something like, at the time of Melito, there might be something like, 4 million Jews in the Roman Empire, and maybe a couple 100,000 Christians. And so they're a tiny minority. The problem is Christianity took off, and it became massive. And in the 4th century, it took over the Roman Empire. By the end of the 4th century, there's something like 30 million Christians in the world. And the reason that is a problem is because those later Christians started taking that earlier rhetoric seriously and started acting out on it. That if Jews hate God and God hates Jews, well, if we're on God's side, we're going to hate Jews. And in fact, if God's going to punish Jews, we need to punish Jews. And so by the end of the 4th century, you start getting very serious anti-Jewish legislation passed by Roman emperors. And that just leads then to the whole history of anti-Judaism through the Middle Ages and down to the history of anti-Semitism in the modern world. It's a very ugly history. And it's not a history that had to happen, and it's not a history that has to continue. Because Jesus was a Jew, and his followers are Jews. And so obviously there can be very positive coexistence, and there needs to be. Even though, of course, in some places there's not. I need to stop there. My time is up. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.